What about this business with the Golan Heights? Because we know that Murdoch and others have got oil franchises sitting there, but this is actually not officially Israeli territory. They took it in the 1967 Six-Day War, I believe, and yet they're now selling oil franchises to people like Rupert Murdoch.
Well, in international law, it doesn't belong to them, it belongs to Syria. And Assad has always said that when we've finished dealing with the terrorists inside Syria, it may be time for us to take back the Golan Heights. And the Israelis have got not a leg to stand on here. It doesn't belong to them. And so, yes, but we need it because otherwise we might come under attack. And, of course, they've been supporting the jihadis inside Syria. That's why the white helmets were evacuated from northern Syria via southern Syria via the Golan Heights by the Israelis. And they've been providing all kinds of support to jihadis, Saudi-aligned al-Nusra, al-Qaeda jihadis inside Syria. And, people in the Middle East actually know what goes on. People in Britain in general don't know what anything of this is about. They think that we're against Islamist terrorism when in actual fact we finance and orchestrate it, and they just don't know the history. And, of course, the Israelis are a democracy, unlike Syria, etc. It's a complete farce, but that's the sort of stuff that, people are spoon-fed in the bubble of Middle England and Middle America.
Times of Israel today, Martin's reporting that in the Golan Heights, Russia is seeking a handover to UN peacekeepers in the area, and they have their own patrols now running along the border.
That's right. They're trying to get back to the status quo ante, which is where the Syrian government controlled all the way up to the border, and the Israelis are in control of the Golan Heights. But it's still not satisfactory for the Israelis being in control of the Golan Heights. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, we said Kuwait doesn't belong to you. You've got to give it back. But when the Israelis invade something, oh no, you can keep that. And they're actually planning to completely annex it and make it part of Israel, even though the population isn't Israeli. They're moving settlers in there.
The United Nations has got very different ideas, because on Tuesday this week, UN delegates in Damascus discussed peacekeepers in the Golan Heights demilitarised zone for the first time for many years. A delegation of UN commanders visited Damascus for talks with the Syrian Defence Minister Ali Abdullah Ayoub on the redeployment of the world's body's peacekeepers to the volatile demilitarised zone in the Israeli-occupied Syria Golan Heights. So is it feasible that the UN actually might do something after, whatever it's 67, 70, 80, 90, that's what, nearly 50 years?
Well, the UN was used to have a tripwire force there, and they had one in South Lebanon as well. Ultimately, that's still not correct, because the Golan Heights do, and don't forget the Golan Heights have got lots of oil underneath them, and that oil could be used to rebuild Syria after the Israelis and the Western powers and Al-Qaeda have killed loads of people and smashed the infrastructure. They need that oil to rebuild. Why should the Israelis, who smashed Syria up, have that oil? That's not fair, that's not reasonable, and ultimately there's going to be a major Middle East war. And the Israelis have got to lose it.
We've got an interesting situation here with the Russians on one side and the Israelis on the other.
Well, that's what's making the situation calmer, because the Russians are trying to calm everybody down. They're trying to interpose themselves into the situation and say to the Israelis, you back off, and saying to the Iranians, you back off. But ultimately, of course, that's not really fair, because the Israelis are the aggressors. They seized that land. It doesn't belong to them. It should go back to the people it does belong to.
All's fair, Martin, in love and war. You know that.
Well,
it's
indeed.
what you can get away with.
It's what you can get away with. But, of course, ultimately, if you carry on cheating, lying, stealing, ultimately you might lose. And that's what the Israelis have got to consider.
Now, we heard last week from Ayelet Shaked. She's the Justice Minister from Israel, and I think we might have a series of these. Have a listen to some of these people and what they've got to say from the Israeli cabinet. And this week we're going to hear a bit about their policy because we've had such a horrific situation back in April and May this year, with so many people, unarmed civilians, being shot dead by the Israeli forces. I wonder how this fits into their so-called Homeland Security, which is a sort of, I guess, it's like a sort of armed wing of the Home Office in Israel. So let's have a listen now to the Homeland Security Minister, Gilad Erdan, see what he's got to say about the way they're dealing with what they call is the terrorism by the Palestinians.
The two defining characteristics of the new wave of terror are, as I mentioned yesterday, one, the central role of incitement and radicalization, especially online, and two, the simplicity of the attacks, which are carried out by individuals with easily accessible weapons and without the command and control structures of traditional terrorist groups. Or to put it another way, high-tech communications and low-tech operations. Since the start of the wave of lone wolf terror in Israel began September 2015, we've experienced hundreds of serious terror attacks. In the period leading up to the outbreak of these attacks, and especially in the first half year of the terror wave, we were witness to an intense campaign of online and real-world incitement. This incitement, which continues as we speak, has a number of themes. Some are religious, such as the absurd and absolutely false libel that Israel plans to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. While this libel has no basis in reality, we saw it. It has led young religious Muslims to attack Jews in order, as they see it, to defend Al-Aqsa. Another theme is the glorification of terrorists. Those who've carried out murderous attacks are celebrated as heroes, martyrs, shaheeds, online and in the streets. This incitement also included an intense campaign of delegitimization against the very existence of the State of Israel. And, as you all know, when you delegitimize a country or its culture or its values, you basically legitimize violence against it. We have taken a number of steps to counter this incitement. None of these steps were simple. They not only presented operational challenges, but, as you know, many raise dilemmas that go to the heart of the balance that we all believe that is needed between the right to free speech, for example, and the right to personal safety, between the individual's right to privacy, for example, another example, and the public's right to go about daily life without fear.
Well, the irony there, Martin, is he's talking about this September 2015. That was the Israeli Homeland Security Minister Gilad Erdan speaking just a few weeks ago. This was kind of put across as well. This was a Islamic mob, an Arab mob that the Israelis had to put down, and that it sparked of a whole load of knife attacks by Arabs on Israelis. But if you actually go back and have a look, you'll find that it was the main problem there was that the Israeli soldiers had actually stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Now, this is incredibly important contested territory here, this Temple Mount space, isn't it? And at the time, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas condemned the attack on Al-Aqsa following clashes at one of Islam's holiest sites. So a lot of it does seem to be based around Al-Aqsa, and it's difficult to extricate it, whereas he's saying there that actually the idea that the Israeli state wants to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a libel. So where do you stand on? Where do you think? How do you make sense of this? Well,
let's put it this way: settlers and extremist Israelis have been constantly trying to enter the Al-Aqsa compound. Ariel Sharon went there with a load of settlers before the first intifada in the 90s.
Just go back to September 2015. What you had was actually Israeli soldiers in the mosque.
Yeah, well, they go in with the settlers to protect them from being attacked by the Muslims, and that means that they're basically taking over the area. Now, of course, don't forget that the Israelis are not supposed to be in Jerusalem at all. The original borders of the Israeli state were all on the coastal.
Hang on, let's just focus
on the coastal area.
Focus on Al-Aqsa for a minute, as he was doing. Right, the Israeli security personnel used tear gas and stun grenades as they entered the compound to arrest what they called Palestinian stone throwers. So maybe they were children who'd run into the mosque.
Yeah, but
surely the authorities got a right to run into the church.
Well, no, I come back to my initial point. When the State of Israel was recognised in 1948, it was given clear borders, and the borders definitely did not include Jerusalem. And, of course, they captured West Jerusalem in the 1967 war, and then they claimed that they were going to keep it. Now, in actual fact, if you take something in war and say, well, I've taken it in war, but we're going to keep it, well, the answer is, we're going to take it off you in war, and you're not going to have it, because there are no rules. You can just take what you want and you can keep it. In that case, we're at war with you. We're at war with you. And therefore, don't complain if somebody stabs one of your soldiers with a knife, because that's what's going to happen if you've got a war, isn't it? And of course, all of the settlers' villages in the West Bank, do you know what they're justified by under Israeli law? They're justified as necessary for military purposes, that they need to have settlements in the West Bank for military reasons to keep the population under control.
Well, the settlers were very much involved in this incident back in September 2015.
That means
the manager of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Omar Kiswani, said to Al Jazeera that 80 Jewish settlers protected by the Israeli police attacked the mosque when confronted by Palestinian volunteer guards. A statement issued by the Israeli police said that masked protesters who were inside the mosque threw stones and fireworks at the police. So, I mean, I guess this is just like, which side do you believe?
Indeed, and I come back to the main point, which is, should the Israelis be in Jerusalem at all? And of course, when the UN recognised Israel in 1948, it was given clear borders, like Serbia or anywhere else. But they've never stayed within those borders.
It's their Jewish homeland, Martin.
Well, what's the border of that Jewish homeland? They don't think
it must include Jerusalem.
No, it doesn't. No, in 1948,
that's the Jewish capital.
No, it doesn't matter. But in 1948, there was not a big Jewish community in Jerusalem. There was no, just as there's not a big Serbian community in Kosovo. But we went to war with Serbia to prevent them having Kosovo. We dropped thousands of tons of bombs on them and killed thousands of civilians because Serbia was not allowed to have Kosovo. It used to be part of Kosovo, but now it hasn't got a Serbian majority. It's got an overwhelming Albanian Muslim majority. And we went to war with Serbia. And you know who didn't support the war with Serbia over that? The Israelis, because they knew exactly what the principle being created was, that you're not to have land grabs in the 21st century. Now, in actual fact, the Israelis have got to give up land grabs. The border between Gaza and Israel, the people in Gaza used to live on the farms which the Israelis claim are theirs. And they say that the border between Gaza and them is a border. It's not a border, it's a ceasefire line. Now, in actual fact, there's never been a peace deal signed between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That means that everybody's at war, and the Israelis are going to have to stay at war until they play by the rules.
Gilad Erdan, we just heard from there, also was talking about online radicalisation. He's saying that this is one of the main things that they've got to stop, people getting radicalised online, although the evidence does seem to be that people are quite radical anyway.
Well, there would be. If you go around shooting people and oppressing them, they tend to get radicalised, don't they? That's what happened to the Jewish settlers in the 1940s. The Irgun and the Haganah that went around killing British soldiers because they were radicalised.
His answer seems to be to send little messages over to Mark Zuckerberg saying, please remove this website from Facebook.
Ahmed Tamimi had a Facebook account closed and all the rest of it. What they want to do is they want to control the narrative about what's going on. And, of course, when he talks about their delegitimization of the Israeli state, that is absolutely freedom of speech. The Israeli state was recognised within certain agreed borders in 1948. They have never agreed to settle for those borders. That means that the state is illegitimate and ultimately should be de-recognised by the United Nations. I say that absolutely openly. That's not an anti-Semitic position. That's a political position. And in Britain, we've got a particular responsibility because we agreed to hand over the Palestinian land to the Zionist occupiers that now are occupying.
I thought we were just driven out by a military means.
No, but in 1917 we agreed that the Balfour Declaration was put together by the British and the Americans and the Zionists to create an Israeli state. And I think if the Israeli state continues to be an aggressive state, a problem in the Middle East to the extent that it creates radicalisation so that we're being blown up in Britain because of the radicalisation caused by the Israelis, then we've got a vested interest in making sure they behave themselves for just looking after our own best interests.
Well, you're not the only person that thinks that, Martin, because also there's this chap who is the World Jewish Congress president. He's announced this week that he fears the impact of the Israeli government's destructive actions. which is a fairly strong statement for the President of the World Jewish Congress, Ronald S. Lauder. He's warned that the Israeli government, the likely impact of its destructive actions on the state's relationship with Jews worldwide. Writing in the New York Times, he argues Israel's government to listen to the voices of protest and outrage being heard in Israel and throughout the Jewish world. In particular, Lauder cites the decision in 2017 to withdraw from an agreement that would create an egalitarian prayer area at the Western Wall and proposed a strict conversion law that impinges on the rights of non-Orthodox Jews. The President also pointed to steps taken this year, including a law denying equal rights to same-sex couples and the nation-state law, legislation that may have severe national and international repercussions.
Well, he's a moderate Zionist, and what he's saying is if you carry on being extreme, as the Israeli government currently is, then the question of whether Israel should be there at all is going to come onto the agenda. And I'm afraid I'm already there. There is a question whether they should be there at all.
I mean, why haven't we heard... We've heard a lot about Jeremy Corbyn. We haven't heard this, have we? According to him, many Jews now wonder if the nation they cherish is losing its way.
Well, that's because there used to be a liberal support for Israel on the basis that it was a democratic state with a strong labour movement, etc. But that's long gone. The Israelis themselves have killed off the two-state solution that everybody was talking about as a compromise. Now, if there's no two-state solution, then we're going back to a straightforward... Everybody is going to have to be a one-state solution. The Israelis can stay there. The Palestinians can come back from wherever they've gone, and then we'll have a democratic election, and we'll see who runs Israel-Palestine. And, of course, in numerical terms, it won't be the Jewish population. It'll be the Arab-Muslim population who are always the majority.
The BBC this week, according to the Middle East Monitor, has bowed to pressure from Israel and changed a Gaza headline. The BBC once again has come under sharp criticism over its coverage of violence perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinians. Critics called the BBC out over its bias after the broadcaster, bound to pressure from the Israel Foreign Ministry, changed the headline of a news piece concerning Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. The BBC headline read, Israel airstrikes kill woman and baby, for a news piece related to the killing of 3 Palestinians, including a pregnant mother and a toddler in Gaza on Wednesday night. Last Wednesday night. The headline attracted the attention of Israel's Foreign Ministry, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, who's leading a bitter campaign against Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, and the Foreign Ministry spokesman Emmanuel Nashon shot the BBC down and demanded for the headline to be changed immediately. So Israel airstrikes kill pregnant woman and baby then got changed to... I'll tell you what it got changed to in a minute, but this is a bit concerning when a foreign government can just contact a state broadcaster and tell them to change a headline like this.
Well, and then they give in and change it. I mean, they can contact them if they like, but the BBC shouldn't give in to that kind of pressure, but of course it does. And that's, of course, over time, creates a situation where the Israeli point of view and their way of looking at the world becomes ingrained in everybody else's point of view. And, of course, that's just not right. It's just not right. They're basically making special pleading all the time. And, of course, when they're using aircraft here, they're using aircraft on Gaza, and, of course, the Gazans have got no aircraft. When Gaddafi did that, we went to war with him. When Serbia did that in Kosovo, we went to war with them. But the Israelis not only use aircraft on civilians, we pat them on the back and say, there, never mind. Now, this is totally incompatible. And, of course, in actual fact, the smart Israelis know very well that the war in Yugoslavia created the principle that there should be no ethnic cleansing. And that means, in actual fact, that a lot of Israel is an ethnically cleansed, unlegitimate state. So let me just clarify this. The 2 headlines. First, it was Israeli airstrikes kill 3, including pregnant mother and toddler in Gaza. That was then changed to Gaza airstrikes kill woman and child after rockets hit Israel. Yes, so in other words, they say that they're trying to make it seem as if they're responding to some rocket attack. But, of course, that's not even the case. The airstrike was nothing to do with the rocket attack.
Well, it might have been just a response to it. I mean, that may be correct.
No, it may be correct and it may not be. And in any case, the BBC should be allowed to have their headline if it's true. And, of course, the fact of the matter is that most of the people in Gaza used to live on the other side of the fence in that part of Israel which Israel claims. They actually literally used to live in those farms.
Well, look,
that's their land that's been taken off them.
It's really hotting up over there because this week we've had an Israeli minister saying Iran should disappear from the world. Iran should entirely disappear from the world. That's what Israeli Minister of Public Security Gilad Erdan, that chap we were hearing from earlier, had to say when asked about US President Donald Trump's decision on Monday to reimpose anti-Iran sanctions that were lifted under a historic nuclear deal between Tehran and 6 world powers. Well, that story was actually just this week, even though, of course, the Iran deal was dumped many months ago. So is that okay for the Israeli minister to say Iran should disappear from the world?
Well,
it's been there for quite a few millennia, hasn't it?
It has, and I would suggest that that's the sort of thing that if Jeremy Corbyn said it, it'd be calls for resignation. But when an Israeli politician says it, it's just, oh dear, never mind. Now, the fact is that the extreme right in Israel have taken control of the situation. They're already in possession of lots of land they shouldn't have, and through various wars. They're far more in defiance of international norms, far more than Serbia was in the 1990s. When are we going to war with Israel? Because we're going to have to in the end,
a top Syrian scientist is killed, and fingers point at Israel. We hear August the 6th in the New York Times. Aziz Asbar was one of Syria's most important rocket scientists, bent on amassing an arsenal of precision-guided missiles that could be launched with pinpoint accuracy against Israeli cities hundreds of miles away. And he's been killed. But I think it was Charles Shoebridge that rather cleverly pointed out that, interestingly, the killing was claimed by a group linked to Al-Qaeda, which might suggest, as often, Israeli-Al-Qaeda cooperation. Indeed. Charles Shoebridge, of course, used to be an anti-terrorist officer here in the Metropolitan Police. Al-Qaeda is a creation of the Saudis, the Western intelligence services, and Mossad. And therefore, Al-Qaeda, when it carries out attacks in Syria or in the West, is actually working with the Israeli intelligence services and with our own intelligence services. They are the terrorists. Isn't it better that
we are at war with
Isn't it better that these people get killed before they build these awful weapons?
Well, in that case, what we need to be seeing is some selective assassination of Israeli officials and military personnel.
I mean, it does suggest...
Because they're the ones behind it all. Al-Qaeda is run by Mossad. Never mind killing individual members of Al-Qaeda. Let's find the generals in Mossad who are running Al-Qaeda and assassinate them. Maybe Navy SEAL team should go in there and sort them out.
Martin, what's alleged is that this guy was actually running a chemical weapons facility.
Well, we don't know the truth of what he was or what he was doing, although there's a book come out recently you'll be aware of, Tony, where they admit they've been involved in at least 2,500 assassinations across the Middle East in the last 10 years. They claim to be a democratic state, but they're involved in 2,500 assassinations. If their politicians and leaders were being assassinated, they'd scream blue murder and say it's all terrorism. When they do it, it's fine.
So are Israel and Syria at war? Were these sorts of things
Well, no, they're not at war because there was a ceasefire signed in 1973, which settled it was a ceasefire. But it wasn't a peace deal, just a ceasefire. And, of course, they've been intervening in the Syrian war to protect their protégés, including al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda. And everybody in Syria and the Middle East knows very well that Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, is Mossad, is MI6, is CIA. It's all the same stuff.
The Middle East Eye has been saying this week the Israel lobby is leading a witch hunt against Jeremy Corbyn, and it has to stop. Britain's Labour Party's tearing itself apart over anti-Semitism charges disingenuously cooked up by political opponents. So Richard Silverstein in the Middle East Eye, in order to understand the true motivation behind Labour's anti-Semitism charges, it's important to focus less on the actual charges and more on the organisations making them, he says.
That's right. Well, Silverstein is a very honourable Jewish professor in the United States who actually lost his position in the university because of his opposition to Israeli policy. His parents died in the Holocaust. He's an absolutely honourable man, and he's basically pointing out the truth. The truth is that the Israeli state is far too big for its boots. They intervene in everybody's business. They tell the BBC what to do. They run Al-Qaeda. They carry out assassinations, and many, of course, of the more extreme Islamist groups which they're opposing them are actually run by Shin Bet and and Mossad anyway.
Again, back to Middle East Monitor, and Lieberman says war on Gaza is just a matter of time. It's only a matter of time before Israel launches a new offensive against the Gaza Strip. Defence Minister Avigdor Lieberman said yesterday the Jerusalem Post reported him saying the question of the next round of fighting is not whether, but when.
Yes, and if they use air power, no doubt the RAF will go in and shoot them down like they did in Libya. And then we'll bomb the Israeli military facilities until they agree to withdraw. That's what we did in Libya. That's what we did in Serbia. Surely we'll do that to the Israelis, won't we, if we're going to be fair about people who use overwhelming force against civilians? But, of course, that's not going to happen, is it? Ultimately, of course, what may happen is they do go to war with Iran and lose, because Hezbollah defeated them in 2006, and in actual fact, they can't win a war with Iran. So maybe it's time for bring it on.
Do you think that's an awful thing to say? Because there would be thousands, possibly tens of thousands, killed in Gaza.
Well,
why is it military fighting civilian population like that?
Because war in the modern era, Tony, 80% of the casualties are civilian. That was the same in the Second World War. It's the same in every war since. War kills civilians. Some of those civilians have got credit cards and friends in America, and they're real people, and some of the civilians are just poor, and they haven't even got access to the internet, so they don't count. Yeah, like children in Yemen, they're not real people. They're not real people that go shopping in shopping malls like in Israel.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.
Now we turn to look at China because there's been a UN report this week which has pointed out that there are actually up to 1 million people in Xinjiang province, I think it's called, in the west of the country, who there are attempts to...